You don't need a US visa to form a Delaware company. Formation is paperwork, not immigration. The real stress for non-residents starts right after the certificate. Getting an EIN, choosing a registered agent correctly, and then passing bank onboarding without getting stuck in compliance limbo. So, this is a practical, step-by-step Delaware setup for non-resident founders in 2026, built around the most common questions we hear. The main idea is simple: your geography matters way less than your process.
When founders say we'll register in Delaware, they usually mean one thing, but in practice it's a sequence. First, you form the entity with the Delaware Division of Corporations. Then you obtain a federal tax identifier from the IRS. After that, you build the legal and governance layer so the company isn't just a piece of paper. And finally, you make it operational through banking and payments, which is where non-residents feel the most friction. Only the first step is purely Delaware. Everything else is federal tax administration and financial compliance, and that's why this topic feels harder than it should. Let's make it predictable. You can form a Delaware LLC or a Delaware corporation. The filing mechanics are different, but the more important point is that the choice should match what you'll do next. Fundraising, issuing equity to a team, and how standard your setup needs to look to investors and banks. We're not redoing the entire LLC versus C-Corp debate here. We covered that in the previous episode, because today is about the operational path a non-resident follows either way. Before you file, have backup names ready, because Delaware won't accept confusingly similar names, and founders waste time getting emotionally attached to a name that can't be approved. At the same time, decide early what address you will use for ordinary business correspondence. That's not the same thing as the registered agent address, and confusing those two later is one of the simplest ways to create mismatches that banks and tax administration don't love. Here's the first requirement that Delaware does not compromise on. Every Delaware entity must maintain a registered agent with a physical street address in Delaware. State's own division of corporations explains this and describes the agent's role in receiving service of, process, and official notices. You can be in Kyiv or Warsaw, Dubai or Buenos Aires, and Delaware anyway still needs a local point of contact, and that's your agent. One practical note: don't choose an agent purely on price. Choose one that behaves like an adult operational partner, because clean document forwarding and consistent records matter later, especially for bank onboarding. Now you file the actual formation document. For a corporation, it's a Certificate of Incorporation. For an LLC, it's a Certificate of Formation. Delaware's official guidance points founders to its electronic filing route through the document filing and certificate request service. The filing itself can be straightforward, but founders underestimate the downstream impact. What you put into the structure at this stage needs to align with what comes next: proving ownership and control, signing contracts, and presenting a coherent setup to banks. Once the company exists, you'll need the federal tax identifier used for tax filings and commonly required for banking and payment processors. This is where myths appear. You need a social security number, or you have to fly to the US. The Internal Revenue Service's own instructions for Form SS4, updated January 13, 2026, explain the available methods for applying and state that only international applicants can receive an EIN by telephone, and they also describe fax processing under the FaxTIN program. So no, a visa is not the gate. An EIN is tax administration, not immigration. The real gate is accuracy and consistency. The SS4 must be completed correctly, your details must match across documents, and you should expect more verification steps as a non-resident than a US resident founder. This is the part where founders get frustrated. We formed the company, we got the identification number, why won't the bank open the account? Because banks are not verifying your intentions. They are meeting regulatory obligations. Under the US Customer Identification Program rule, banks must use risk-based procedures to verify identity and form a reasonable belief they know the true identity of the customer opening the account. For legal entity customers, banks also have beneficial ownership, identification, and verification obligations under FinCEN's beneficial ownership rule framework. That's why non-resident onboarding can be slower. The risk scoring is often higher, so compliance asks for more clarity. The winning strategy is not find a magical bank, it's to make your application boring. You want a coherent story, supported by consistent documents that answers the questions compliance teams always have. Who owns the company? Who controls it? What the company actually does? How money will move? And why that flow makes sense. This is one of the places Icon.Partners helps most often, not by promising shortcuts, but by packaging the structure and documentation so compliance doesn't have to guess. A lot of founders still operate on outdated assumptions about BOI reporting under the Corporate Transparency Act. FinCEN's March 2025 Interim Final Rule removed BOI reporting requirements for US companies and US persons, and FinCEN explains on its BOI materials that entities created in the United States are now exempt, while certain foreign companies registered to do business in the US may still have reporting requirements. Forming a Delaware entity is not the same as a non-US company registering in the US, and the compliance lane can differ. Because this area has moved quickly, you should always confirm the current FinCEN position when you're about to file anything. Here's the punchline. You can form a Delaware company remotely. You can obtain an identification number as a non-resident through processes described by Revenue Service. And you can pass bank verification without a visa, but only if your structure and documentation are coherent, because banks are required to verify identity and apply risk-based onboarding. So the advantage isn't being closer to the US. The advantage is having a clean sequence and a compliance-ready setup.
If you want help putting this together end-to-end, Delaware formation, registered agent coordination, EIN application prep, and making the company bank-ready, Icon.Partners does that as part of our US setup work for non-resident founders. And our next topic will be taxes and reporting in the USA, how to avoid IRS penalties, because formation is the beginning and staying compliant is what keeps the company alive.